Hello, this is Nick Nielsen of Grand Strategy, The View from Oregon. Today I'm going to be talking about existential lessons of the Cold War. It is 15 January 2016. The Cold War forced us to think in global terms. In other words, it forced us to think in planetary terms. The planet was divided into two armed camps, with one camp led by the U.S., presiding over NATO, and the other camp led by the USSR, presiding over the Warsaw Pact. Every action taken, or every action forborne, was weighed and judged against its planetary consequences, and this became most evident when faced with the ultimate Cold War nightmare, a massive nuclear exchange between the superpowers that came to be known as MAD. MAD, an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction. It is at least arguable that the idea of anthropogenic existential risk emerged from Cold War MAD scenarios. What do I mean by anthropogenic existential risk? An existential risk is a risk that threatens the existence of life on Earth, or more narrowly, human life or human civilization. Threats that originate from human action are anthropogenic. So an anthropogenic existential risk is the risk of the extinction of human life or of human civilization as a result of human action. The paradigmatic form of human action that could result in human extinction or the end of civilization has been nuclear war, or more specifically, a scenario of mutually assured destruction in which nuclear powers employed all of their nuclear assets in one sudden spasm, a massive exchange of missiles, rather than risk losing these assets or conceding loss in a nuclear war. Once both sides in the Cold War had armed themselves with intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, this was a possibility that faced the world every day throughout the Cold War. The visionary thinking of the Cold War period has been tainted by its association with what was then openly called the unthinkable, a massive thermonuclear exchange. These true visionaries wasted no time with utopian fantasies that we all would have liked to believe, but rather they were the ones who unflinchingly explored the implications of what Karl Jaspers called the new fact. Anthropogenic extinction became technologically possible with the advent of the nuclear era, and because it was made possible, it became a pressing need to discuss it honestly. In this sense, the great visionaries of the recent past have been men like Giulio Douhet and Herman Kahn. Douhet's work predates the nuclear age, but Douhet was a great visionary of air power, and the extent to which Douhet understood that air power could change warfare is remarkable. Here, for example, is a quote from his treatise, The Command of the Air. Quote, "No longer can areas exist in which life can be lived in safety and tranquility, nor can the battlefield any longer be limited to actual combatants. On the contrary, the battlefield will be limited only by the boundaries of the nations at war, and all their citizens will become combatants, since all of them will be exposed to the aerial offensives of the enemy. There will be no distinction any longer between soldiers and civilian. The defenses on land and sea will no longer serve to protect the country behind them, nor can victory on land or sea protect the people from enemy aerial attacks unless that victory assures the destruction by actual occupation of the enemy's territory of all that gives life to his aerial forces." Unquote. From Giulio Douhet, The Command of the Air, translated by Dino Ferrari, Washington, D.C. Air Force History and Museums Program, 1998, pages 9 and 10. There have been many predictions for future warfare that have not been borne out in practice, but with hindsight we can see that Douhet was right about almost everything he predicted, and, more importantly, he was right for the right reasons. He saw, he understood, he drew the correct implications, and he laid out his vision with admirable clarity. The Cold War standoff between the U.S. and the USSR was a consequence of the implications of air power already glimpsed by Douhet in 1921, and which were then raised to a higher order of magnitude by advanced technology weapon systems. When Douhet wrote his work, there were no jet engines, no ballistic missiles, no nuclear weapons, but Douhet's vision was so comprehensive and so accurate that these major technological innovations did not alter the basic framework that he predicted. Citizens did become combatants, and the citizens of each side were held hostage by the other. This is the essence of the MAD scenario. Despite the targeting of civilian population centers being the essence of deterrence through mutually assured destruction, there's both a distaste and a hesitation in acknowledging this. A particular example of this unwillingness, even of scholars, to acknowledge a reality that Giulio Due foresaw long before it even became a reality, is furnished by the declassification of a Strategic Air Command target list from the 1950s, titled SAC Atomic Weapons Requirement Study for 1959. The report was authored in June 1956 and was released to the public in December 2015, almost 60 years after it was written. It includes the most extensive target list ever published from previously classified sources. At the time the report was written, the U.S. relied almost exclusively on Strategic Air Command's bombers to deliver a nuclear strike. ICBMs began to appear in 1958 and 59, both in the Soviet Union and in the U.S., and submarine-launched ballistic missiles were still some years in the future, so any massive strike at the time would have to been delivered by bombers. Commenting on the recently released target list, the National Security Archive page states in relation to planned systematic destruction of urban targets, quote, "Purposefully targeting civilian populations as such directly conflicted with the international norms of the day, which prohibited attacks on people per se, as opposed to military installations with civilians nearby," unquote. The New York Times article on the report release, 1950s U.S. Nuclear Target List, offers chilling insight, has this to say, and here I begin to quote from the article. It lists many targets for systematic destruction in major cities, including 179 in Moscow, like agricultural equipment and transformers heavy, 145 in Leningrad, and 91 in East Berlin. The targets are referred to as DGZs, or Designated Ground Zeros. While many are industrial facilities, government buildings, and the like, one for each city is simply designated population. "It's disturbing for sure to see the population centers targeted," said William Burr, a senior analyst at the National Security Archive, a research group at George Washington University that obtained the target list in response to a request first made in 2006. Mr. Burr, who specializes in nuclear history, said he believed it was the most detailed target list the Air Force had ever made public. And here I end my quote from the article. I find it a bit odd that these sources should be cited expressing surprise at the systematic bombing of population centers, as in 1956 the memory of the bombing of Germany, during the day by the Americans and at night by the British, was still relatively fresh in the minds of those who participated. Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of Strategic Air Command when the recently released report was written, was in large measure responsible for the efficacy of U.S. daylight raids in Germany. He rode in the lead plane and would court-martial crews that turned around. The plan to employ nuclear assets to level the Soviet Union, including targeting population centers, was the logical and linear extension of the policy actually pursued against Germany and Japan during the Second World War. Everyone knew what was being done. Bombing was insufficiently accurate to precision bomb exclusively military targets, so area bombing campaigns with the object of dehousing war industry workers was systematically and explicitly pursued. Everyone knew what was being done, and many nevertheless found it distasteful. At the end of the Second World War, Arthur Bomber Harris, who had presided over the Royal Air Force efforts as LeMay had presided over American efforts, retired to South Africa because of the opprobrium that had become attached to the ruthless efficacy of his strategy. After Dresden, even Churchill had second thoughts. But the war was won and the Nazis were defeated, and this was equally well understood at the time by everyone as a war aim that could only be attained by the unconditional surrender of Germany. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been much discussion of strategic bombing. An explicitly philosophical treatise has been written to denounce it as immoral. In A.C. Grayling's Among the Dead Cities, Was the Allied Bombing of Civilians in World War II a Necessity or a Crime? And in Firestorm, Allied Air Power and the Destruction of Dresden, Marshal de Brühl questions the utility and rationale of strategic bombing. Caleb Card denounces it in his The Lessons of Terror. But it is misleading to try to understand strategic bombing in an exclusively moral or political sense. Strategic bombing is an expression of our culture. Let me try to explain how this is so with a detour through political philosophy. Hannah Arendt is especially remembered for her argument that 20th century totalitarianism and fascism is a political outcome of the emergence of what she called mass man. Arendt wrote, quote, "What will happen once the authentic mass man takes over we do not yet know. Although it may be fair to guess he will have more in common with the meticulous, calculated correctness of Himmler than with the hysterical fanaticism of Hitler, will more resemble the stubborn dullness of Molotov than the sensual, vindictive cruelty of Stalin." Unquote. While Arendt professed not to know the full consequences of mass man as a political phenomenon, the Second World War revealed the social dimensions of mass man and mass warfare. Indeed, I would argue that mass warfare is a nearly inevitable historical outcome of the emergence of mass man in history. It may be horrific, but that is not to be treated as some kind of anomaly. This style of warfare perfectly matches the structure of our society today. 20th century campaigns of mass death and strategic bombing were brought into being by popular sovereignty, not in spite of it. Where vox populi is law, to influence the feeling or perceptions of a mass population through terror or other means is a coherent strategy of war. The Second World War was the background to the Cold War, and in a sense, we can think of the Second World War as the proof of concept of mass destruction of mass population centers, a concept initially suggested by the first global industrialized war, what we of course called the First World War, and initially formulated as doctrine by Giulio Douhet. In the same way that the Second World War was the background of the Cold War, the strategic bombing of the Second World War was the background to the strategic bombing envisioned by nuclear planners during the Cold War. This brought the development of mass war to its logical end with nuclear weapons, the telos of mass destruction, which was then formulated as doctrine in mutually assured destruction. This was mass war for mass man, and as such mass war against mass man in the form of industrialized cities and their suburbs were targets of war, as Douhet had seen decades earlier. The increasing scale and efficacy of nuclear weapons and their delivery systems did not substantially change Douhet's framework, but by raising the stakes of destructiveness, nuclear weapons, jet bombers, and missiles did change the scope of warfare from mere localized destruction to a potential planetary catastrophe. Many scientists began to discuss the potential consequences of the use of nuclear weapons for life and for civilization, and many of the physicists who worked on the Manhattan Project later felt misgivings about their role in releasing the nuclear genie from the bottle. These concerns were not confined to Western scientists. In an internal report to the Soviet leadership, nuclear physicist Igor Kurchatov, for whom the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow is named, wrote bluntly about the possibility of human extinction in the event of nuclear war in a document titled The Danger of Nuclear War from 1954. Quote, "Calculations show that if, in the case of war, weapons that already existed are used, levels of radioactive emissions and concentration of radioactive substances, which are biologically harmful to human life and vegetation, will be created on a significant portion of the Earth's surface. The rate of growth of atomic explosives is such that in just a few years, the stockpile will be large enough to create conditions under which the existence of life on the whole globe will be impossible. The explosion of about 100 hydrogen bombs would lead to this result. There is no hope that organisms, and the human organism in particular, will adjust themselves to higher levels of radioactivity on Earth. This adjustment can take place only through a prolonged process of evolution, so we cannot but admit that mankind faces the threat of an end to all life on Earth." Unquote. From Igor Kurchatov, The Danger of Atomic War, 1954. Kurchatov's formulations are striking in their unaffected naturalism and in the bluntness of the message that he sought to communicate. Even as Kurchatov wrote of the end of the world, he avoided histrionics. His account of human extinction is what philosopher Colin McGinn might call flatly natural. The effect of a flatly natural and dispassionately scientific account of the end of the world is perhaps the more powerful for avoiding emotional and rhetorical excess. The all-too-real possibility of human extinction at the hands of human beings needs no histrionics, and it would only be weakened by an attempt at dramatics. The space age began 3 years after Kurchatov's memo on the dangers of nuclear war, when Sputnik was launched on 4 October 1957. Thereafter, a space race paralleled the arms race and became a new venue for superpower competition. While the space race provided many inspiring moments that continue to resonate even today, almost 50 years later, we continue to cite the landing of a man on the moon as one of the signal technological triumphs of our civilization. There was also a darker side to this exuberant rivalry. Bertrand Russell, for example, was scathing in his righteous ridicule of the space program as being merely a symptom of the Cold War and superpower competition. Russell had a point. We would never have gone to the moon in 1969 if this achievement had not been insistently driven by superpower competition. But this isn't the whole story. We cannot reduce the origins of the space program to superpower competition, though we must acknowledge the crucial role played by this competition. Rocketry in the second half of the 20th century was a classic risk-opportunity trade-off, like artificial intelligence or nanoscale engineering today. Building rockets was necessary for mastering the technology of ballistic missiles, and the development of this technology carried the risk of warfare that could destroy civilization across the planet in less than 1 hour. But the same technology carried the opportunity of peaceful uses that could change the future of civilization, as certainly as military uses could end the future of civilization. As of today, the risk has remained unrealized, but the opportunity has already played a role in reshaping human perceptions of themselves and their place in the universe. It has become a commonplace of commentary on the Apollo missions that this was the occasion of an intellectual turning point in our collective self-understanding. The photograph of Earth taken from space on the way to the moon, sometimes called the blue marble photograph, was a way to communicate to the public some hint of what Frank White calls the overview effect. Again, we were forced to think in planetary terms by this new image of Earth hanging isolated against the blackness of space. Earth was achingly beautiful, as we all saw, but also terribly vulnerable. Later, from a much farther vantage point in our solar system, we would see Earth not as a blue marble, but merely as a pale blue dot, further diminishing our home in the cosmos. This perspective of an overview effect of an even greater distance provided a stern lesson in Copernicanism. The Cold War arms race and space race came together during the latter part of the 20th century in a kind of cosmic pessimism over the very possibility of the longevity of any civilization whatever, extrapolated far beyond Earth to the possibility of any inhabited planet. When Carl Sagan wrote his Cosmos, A Personal Journey during the height of the Cold War, the concern over nuclear war was such that the final term L in the Drake equation, the length of time a SETI-capable civilization is transmitting or receiving, was frequently judged to be quite short, only a few hundred years at most. This is given a poignant depiction in a dream described in the last episode of Sagan's Cosmos television series. Sagan narrates a dream sequence of visiting a planet that is home to an alien civilization. Gazing down on the planet from space, he sees the lighted night side of the planet, but as he watches, the whole world goes dark. He checks the Book of Worlds, what in an earlier episode he had called the Encyclopedia Galactica, and finds that the world was rated as having less than a 1% chance of survival for the next 100 years. As the narration continues, Sagan comforts himself for this loss by listening to the radio and television broadcasts from Earth. Most of the snippets of news in this montage feature stories of atomic weapons or political tension. As he is listening, the broadcasts from Earth are suddenly interrupted and fall silent. Disturbed by this, wondering why the broadcasts from Earth have suddenly stopped, he looks up the entry for Earth in the Book of Worlds and reviews it. He finds that Earth too was given a chance of survival of less than 1% over the next 100 years. Not very good odds, Sagan observes. He sees that terrestrial civilization has been destroyed by a full nuclear exchange, and he then recites a melancholy litany of things that will be no more with the end of human civilization. Sagan's cosmic perspective on the terrestrial woes of the Cold War was, ironically, one of the legacies of the Cold War. It could be said that nuclear weapons and space exploration, driven by political competition, opened our eyes to our place in the cosmos in a way that might not have made a similar impression if the stakes had not been so high. Samuel Johnson is often quoted for his line, "Depend upon it, sir, when a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully." Similarly, it could be said that the Cold War and the nuclear arms race brought the whole of humanity face to face with extinction, and we pulled back from the brink. Perhaps someday we will speak of Cold War civilization as a subclass of industrial technological civilization, as I have at times spoken of Soviet civilization, despite the Soviet Union having existed for so short a time. Despite the ephemeral nature of the Soviet Union, its leaders aspired to represent a new stage in human civilization, so we can at least speak of Soviet civilization in aspirational terms. The Cold War was a standoff between two distinct visions of future civilization, and, as what Hegel would have called a world historical event, there's a sense in which we can legitimately speak in terms of Cold War civilization. For several decades, we constructed a civilization focused on warfare that was indistinguishable from self-destruction. The Egyptians built pyramids. Medieval Europeans built cathedrals. We built strategic weapon systems, early warning radar stations, and fallout shelters. We not only saw the possibility of mutually assured destruction, we meticulously planned and prepared for a massive nuclear exchange that never happened. We frantically erected the infrastructure of our own self-immolation. Fortunately for us, this was a wasted effort, and this is another existential lesson of the Cold War, that a civilization can exhaust itself in the production of works believed to be socially necessary, but which are ultimately shown to be pointless, or at least not used for the ends intended by their builders. Pyramids and cathedrals are now used as tourist attractions, but the infrastructure of the Cold War, perhaps less beautiful and more ephemeral than pyramids or cathedrals, unintentionally taught us that our fate is in our hands and we have the power to destroy ourselves. The danger is not over, but the human species has been changed by its experience of imminent destruction. Thank you.